Good evening, everybody. I'm standing here to represent the students of the Georg August University Göttingen, and I'm going to give a little speech, and it will be a welcome speech in Norwegian, indeed. Kjære J.Randers, jeg står her som representant av Göttingen studenter, og vil gjerne si hjertelig velkommen hit. Vi er alle kjempeklare for ditt besøk og er nysgjerrige etter foredraget ditt. I går da det begynte å snø, så tenkte jeg, det passer veldig bra at det skal komme en nordmann i morgen da. Så tusen takk for at du er her, og vi håper at du trives veldig godt. Takk for oppmerksomheten. Thanks for your attention.
Good evening. Thank you very much. That was very kind of you. It will remain a secret between us, what you said. I'm delighted to be invited to come here and talk to you, and also I hope that you will get used to my Norwegian English. I speak a perfect example of English with a Norwegian accent. So if you hear anyone talk like this, he is or she is certainly from Norway. I should start by saying that you have in front of you a depressed man with a smiling face. I have spent 40 years working for sustainable development, and I have failed. The world today is less sustainable than when I started this hard work 40 years ago. So a couple of years ago, I changed style, I changed strategy. I'd spent nearly 40 years promoting wise policy, trying to make the systems of governance of the world, democracy, capitalism, authoritarian regimes, to change their style of management, to change their decision procedures, the way in which they decide our common future, and in vain. So, I decided to try to describe as clearly as I can what will be the results of the decision-making style that we have been pursuing over the last 40 years and which I think we will be pursuing over the next 40 years. So basically, hoping that by painting the picture of what will actually happen if we continue as we do, and hope that this would then kick society into action in some final manner, which I have not been able to achieve during the last 40 years. So this is what my talk is all about, and it is of course made in order to stress the importance of sustainable development and to encourage other people to continue the fight in order to get the world to become more sustainable than it was in 1972 when I started my work. As has been said in the introductions, 40 years ago my friends and I wrote the Limits to Growth book. This is a tiny book. It contains 12 scenarios for the world future, 12 pictures of how the world could evolve from 1970 to the year 2100. 6 of those stories were sad stories, where something went wrong in the beginning of the 21st century. Either there was too little food, or too little resources, or too much pollution, or too much problems. 6 of the stories were positive stories, where humanity managed in one way or the other to create a certain degree of sustainability in this century of ours. The important message of the Limits to Growth in 1972 was the fact that we did not know enough at the time to tell which of these 12 futures was the most likely. So we couldn't tell that one of them was more likely than the other. All we could do was basically to recommend to you, to all people, that they would pursue the positive stories, the good stories, the sustainable stories. And we drew a few very general conclusions, like number 1, the planet is very small. Number 2, if growth continues as it had up till 1972 for another 100 years, we certainly would overshoot the sustainable carrying capacity of the planet. And thirdly, that once in overshoot, once one has allowed the system to expand beyond what can be sustained in the long run, there's only one way back, down, either through a managed decline or by leaving it to the market or to nature to reduce human activity. Now we're 40 years down the line, and we have learned a lot. We know, for instance, things like growth has indeed continued for 40 more years. The population of the world, the ecological footprint of the world has continued. Secondly, we do know that the unbelievable has happened. The democracies and the capitalist system and the authoritarian regimes of the world has allowed human activity to expand beyond what can be sustained in the long run. And the simplest proof of this has already been mentioned. It is in the climate arena. Every year, humanity emits into the atmosphere twice as much CO2 as is being absorbed by the forests and the oceans of the world during that year. The difference accumulates in the atmosphere, and the higher the concentration of CO2 is in the atmosphere, the higher is the temperature. And this is, of course, going to continue until we stop emitting CO2 into the atmosphere. So we are in unsustainable territory and needs to get out of it. The third conclusion we can draw after 40 years is that resources have not run out, at least not yet. But we have learned even more over the last 40 years. And we have learned so much, I think, that it is at this point in time, as I've indicated, possible to make a forecast about what will happen over the next 30 to 40 years. It is not possible to tell what will happen over the next 130 years, but on such a short time horizon as 30 to 40, which is so short that humanity will not have the time to modify democracy, to modify capitalism, or to modify the other systems of governance that actually control the future. It is possible to predict this future, and that's what I've done in the 2052 book. There are a lot of numbers, there is a lot of statistics, there is a lot of mathematics, there is a lot of stuff. All of this is available on the book website called www.2052.info, where you can go in and check the whole thing out for free. And there is, of course, the book, which is out in 6 languages, including Chinese. So you can start reading this in great detail if you're interested. I divided the world in 5 regions: the United States, China, the rest of the industrial world, the 14 largest emerging economies, and the rest category, which are the 140 remaining countries, largely poor and largely small. Then I made a forecast for each of these 5 regions, and I sum up the regions, and that becomes the world forecast. And I'll give you a few of the main elements of the world forecast. If you're interested in the detail, read the book. The first and interesting conclusion when you try to describe what will actually happen over the next 40 years is that you see that the world population is actually going to peak at roughly 8 billion people in 2040 and will already be in decline in 2050. This is happening because the women of the world are going to continue the spectacular decline in fertility from 4.5 children per woman in 1970 on average to 2.5 today, down to 1.5 children per woman in 2050. In the rich world, women are going to continue to choose a career rather than choosing more children. In the poor world, the women are increasingly living in urban slums. When it made sense to have a lot of children when you lived in the village, it does not make sense to have children when you live in the urban setting, and they choose not to do so because of the vast expense of having children in the urban slum. The sum of all of this is that the world population will not become as big as you think it will be. It will be in decline already 40 years from now. The second thing which will not evolve the way you think is the world economy. The world economy can be thought of as the world labor force, the number of hands, multiplied with the productivity of those hands. The world labor force will, of course, peak because the population peaks. So we will already in 2050 have a declining workforce in the world. Then comes the question, what about productivity growth? My forecast is that in the rich world, this is in Europe and the United States, in the OECD countries, you will see a stagnation in the productivity growth, which means that the total GDP of the rich world will basically, follow the population developments over the next 40 years. The explanation is simple and very interesting to most people, particularly because the economists don't seem to get this point. So what is happening when you do economic development is you start in a situation with the whole labor force in agriculture, then you add tractors and energy, and you can move some people into manufacturing, then you add machinery, you can move people into simple office work, then you add the computer and you can move people into services, and then you move them onwards into the health sector, into the social care sectors. The richer the country, the more the people are working in the soft, soggy, hopeless type of services and care. And the task at hand in Europe and the United States of America over the next 40 years is to increase productivity among those women that are going to watch me in the old person's home, where I will be in 3 or 4 years. This is very difficult. It's much more difficult to increase productivity here than it was to do here. As a result, the world economy is not going to grow. The rich world economy is hardly going to grow over the next 40 years. Of course, the poor emerging economies, many of them or some of them are going to follow the path of Japan, South Korea, and now China, which is of course moving their societies quickly from agricultural situations to the typical Western or industrial state. The sum total is that the world economy will not be 4 times as big in 2050 as it is today, which is what it would have been if it continued to grow at 3.5%. It will only be twice as big. The third thing you need to learn about the future is that we, that's global society, will be facing a large number of problems. Depletion of resources, pollution, climate damage, climate adaptation, income inequality, you name it. These problems are just waiting to be faced by us. And as time passes by, we will have to do something about it. The simplest way to talk about this is to talk about the United States of America, which is silly enough as a nation that they're not willing to spend the money up front to reduce the climate gas emissions. But then, when they do not spend the money up front, they get the hurricanes, which makes it necessary to repair New Jersey or New Orleans afterwards. And this mechanism is going to basically hit the whole world. Because we're not solving the problems up front, we will have to build the dikes around Netherlands, 20 to 30 years into the future. This fact that we will have to spend money on repair and adaptation over the next 40 years will be to such an extent that although the GDP goes up twice, consumption, global consumption, will most likely level off within the next 20 to 30 years, because we have to use the manpower and the capital that we would otherwise have used to produce consumer goods. We will have to build dikes around Netherlands, and we have to build up cities more frequently than we did in the past because they blow down or whatever. So these are the 3 important things you should try to remember from my talk. That the population development is different than you think, that the economic development is different than you think, and the fact that we will in the end be forced to do all those things that we should, if we were rational, we would have done up front. Once you know these things, And you can look at my spreadsheets and see the thing. It's very quickly to see that how much energy the world is going to need in order to complete this scenario. Energy efficiency is increasing dramatically, has done so over the last 40 years. There is all reason to believe that this will continue. Renewable energy is coming in from the side, you know, slowly, because it is more costly than what is being competed away, but it is coming in. So you do the calculations and you see that the energy use in the world will reach a peak around 2035 and will be in decline. Then you look at the future CO2 emissions that arise from this energy picture, and it's easy to calculate that we, global society, will not cut the 50 to 80% in the greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, which is necessary in order to keep the temperature under, or a rise under +2 degrees centigrade. When you do the calculation, you will see that the emissions in 2050 will be exactly the same as they are today. So we will cut 0 from 2010 to 2050. The only difference is that in 2010, emissions were going up at 3% a year. In 2050, they will be going down at 3% a year. And the reason why the emissions will go down at 3% a year in 2050 is not that there will be reached agreement on a global deal in the 1500 COP, you know, at the time. It is basically because at the time the global economy will be very close to stagnation. Energy efficiency still reduces the energy intensity of the economy, and the renewable resources are gradually taking over from the fossil ones. In my view, in 2050, 40% of all energy will be from renewable sources, 60% will still be from fossil, but going down. The effect of this delay in the reduction in CO2 emissions is that the temperature will continue up, you know, from now, and it will reach, so it's now plus 0.7 degrees over pre-industrial time. In 2050, it will be plus 2 degrees centigrade over pre-industrial time, and this will go possibly up to plus 3 degrees centigrade before it levels off at that time. The sea level rise will be of the order of 30 centimeters in this period, which doesn't bother Norwegians very much, but of course will be a problem for Bangladesh, but then on the other hand, the Indians have already started to build a fence that will try to keep the Bangladeshi, you know, south of the fence and the Indians on the northern side of the fence. And luckily some of the Pacific Islands have now finally bought land from the Church of England, you know, in the Fiji Islands, so they have some place to go when their atolls, you know, sink in the ocean. By these cases, I'm just trying to say that the next 40 years on the climate front will not be a catastrophe, but it will be very unpleasant. It will be an endless sequence of dry weather or wet weather or extreme wind, or you know, the birds don't know when they should fly from here to there, and the farmers wouldn't know when they should plant what they should plant, or when they should apply the pesticides and what kind of pests, etc. So it will be a very gray, sad story, but sadly not one with one great disaster, which might kick democracy into action. So we will not get the help, you know, from an external enemy to finally pull ourselves together and do something. So again, to summarize, what I'm saying is that over the next 40 years, both population growth and GDP growth, or the growth of the economy, will slow. But they will slow by themselves, by human decisions, not because of planetary constraints. So the population growth will stop because women will choose to have fewer children, and the economy will stop because the economists and politicians will not be able to create the type of growth that they will be working very hard to try to materialize. So the situation will be very similar to what it has been in Europe over the last 10 years. We will have 40 years of a flat, long trend where there is a business cycle up and then it goes down and then it goes up and then it goes down, up and down. So endless walk in the desert, just like we have had over the last 10 years. The important point, though, is that this slower growth in population and GDP will still be fast enough to emit enough CO2 to lift the temperature up to the +2 degrees centigrade limit, which is, of course, the internationally agreed danger threshold, and then put it past this level for the second half of the century. The good news, however, there will be no resource shortages over the next 40 years. We will have enough oil, coal, gas, food, lithium for the electric batteries for all the cars, water, you name it, there will be enough. This is, of course, in conflict with what you think you know about resource availability in the world. And this is not because those reports are wrong on the supply side. It is because those reports are wrong on the demand side. Most of the analysis that most people do assume that there will be 10 billion middle-class people in the world in 2050. And if there were 10 billion middle-class people in 2050, yes, then there wouldn't be enough food, oil, gas, the whole thing. We will only be roughly 1/2 as many middle-class people. There will only be of the order of 5 billion middle-class people in 2050. The remaining will be poor people because the GDP growth, you know, when it goes down, it basically means that there is more poverty than there would otherwise have been. So that's the good news. You know, there will be enough of the energy, there will be enough of the food, etc. But I ask you to remember one thing. When I say there will be enough food, that does not mean that there will not be starvation. Because starvation doesn't occur neither now, then, or 40 years ago, because the world is incapable of producing more food. You know, production is determined by demand. And so people starve because of lack of income. They don't starve because we cannot produce. We can produce, in my mind, 3 times as much food on a sustainable basis on the globe as we do today. Still people starve. And we will have the same situation 40 years into the future, that the poor African does not have sufficient income to be able to pay the Ukrainian farmer, you know, to take this excess land in South Russia or in Ukraine and cultivate food and then send it to Africa. That's the reason for starvation in 2050. This is the reason for starvation today, and this was the reason for starvation 40 years ago. So there will be nothing new. Then I'll ask the most important question. How can this arrogant bastard from Norway be so sure that he is right? And it's much better that I ask the question than you asking the question. So the reason why what I am said is correct is that this is the cheapest solution. This is the 2052 forecast. It represents what will happen if society, corporations, individuals, and nations chooses, when there is a choice, the cheapest solution. This is when you, and the point is, I believe that we will continue to do so, because I do think that people are going to continue to pursue their short-term interest. Corporations are going to pursue maximum profit. Society, the economists, are going to pursue the cost-effective solution, and nations are known to pursue their short-term interest. So short-termism is the same as choosing the cheap solution, will prevail, and then generate. The sum of this is the 2052 forecast. So I am pretty sure that I'm right. So you have to convince me that democracy suddenly starts choosing more expensive solution than the cheapest. In other words, go for higher taxes than the lowest tax, or go for more expensive gasoline, or go for more higher price of electricity. Some optimists believe that the market will solve the problem, that capitalism will solve the problem. It will not. Capitalism is made in order to allocate capital to the most profitable project. That's what we learn, we teach, that's what capitalism does. And that's, of course, exactly what we do not need at this point in time. We need to allocate capital to windmills and offshore wind, even though the gas-fired utility is much cheaper. You know, we need to build the electric cars, although the fossil cars are cheaper, etc., etc. Then some other optimists, and particularly the young people, think that the parliament can solve this problem by seeking to align the interest of the corporation with the interest of society. And I say good luck. You know, this is what we have been trying to do for the last 20 years in the simplest case, namely to put a price on carbon emissions. And here we are after 20 years of talking, and we have, for some regions, a carbon price of 4 euros per ton of CO2, when we need 50. So we are in the interesting situation that the short-term nature of the human being is reflected in the pet institutions of us, democracy and capitalism, and ensures that we always choose what is the cheapest or most profitable solution in the short term, and this makes it very simple for forecasters like me to calculate what you will actually decide over the next 40 years. Let me start the summing up. So first of all, when your spouse asks tomorrow, what did he say? I'll tell you what he said so that you remember. So he said that the world population and the economy will grow more slowly towards 2052 than most people expect, but still fast enough to generate a climate crisis. Then he said, consumption will stagnate because world society will have to spend ever more on repair and adaptation. And then he said, the short-term nature of man, reflected in the short-term focus of democracy and capitalism, is the root cause of this development. That's where the problem is. Second part of the end. And here I have to introduce some happiness, because otherwise you get depressed. You should, of course, get depressed, but of course, a much better future is possible. There is nothing that locks us in principle on pursuing short-term behavior. It is technically possible to solve the climate problem, and it's actually not very expensive. All one needs to solve both the climate problem and all the other environmental problems is to move roughly 2% of the workforce and 2% of the capital of the world from dirty sectors to clean sectors. So all we need to do is to take 2% of those guys that currently build fossil cars and force them to make electric cars. Take 2% of those that not the 2%, we need to take those people that build the coal-fired utilities and force them to make windmills and solar panels. We need to take those people that currently build huge apartments with thin walls that require a lot of air conditioning and force them to build slightly smaller apartments with thicker walls so that they don't need so much air conditioning, etc., etc. Umpteen analyses have been done of how big or small this challenge is, and it is small. It is of the order of 2% of the GDP. This means that if we decided to solve the problem, we would be as rich in December 2024 as we will now be in February or March of 2024. So this is totally ridiculous that we're not doing it. But we will not, because at any choice, although 2% is little, it is more than zero. It's more costly than doing nothing, and we will then, of course, choose doing nothing. Finally,
I normally stop at this point in time.
Then people say, but Mr. Randers, can you not please tell us what should be done? And I say, you're wasting my time. You know, it won't be done. I've just told you that, you know, this will happen. And they say, please, please, Mr. Randers, tell us what should be done. And I will tell you, because there will be no question and answer, so you cannot make the comments which waste my time, where you tell me that what I'm going to tell you will not be done. I agree, it will not be done. But the 5 things that needs to be done are the following. First, we need to further slow population growth, and this needs to be done by introducing the one-child family in the rich world. It is rich babies, like my daughter of 30, which is the real problem in the world, with a footprint 20 to 30 times bigger than that of an Indian child. Point number 2, we need to cut CO2 gas emissions quickly. The easiest way to do this is to ban, again in the rich world, the use of coal, oil and gas starting 1st of January 2024. The third thing we need to do is to start helping the poor. And this we will do by allocating all our development aid into building a low-carbon energy system in the poor world and give it away. That's the important part in poverty reduction, is to supply cheap energy. All the other stuff we're doing is essentially wasting their and our time. Fourthly, we need to reduce the ecological footprint in the rich world. Most likely this should be done through compulsory vacation, so that you start to reduce the productive capacity of the economy by forcing people not to work as many hours per year as they do now. This will finally start to draw down production, which might get the consumption, or will get consumption down in the end. Fifthly, we need to temper the national short-termism. That means the only way to do this is to establish supranational institutions that ordered Germany and ordered Norway to do this, that, and the other. And please do not tell me that this will not happen. It will not happen, but this is what would have happened if I were king. And then finally, since we are at it, since incomes are not going to grow over the next 40 years, why don't we use this opportunity to change the goal of modern society from income growth to growth in well-being? So this is what the fight for sustainable development is all about. It is to get my 6-point program in place. At the deepest level, the problem is to convince the current generations to actually do a sacrifice which is bigger than 0, but not very big, in order to get an uncertain advantage for children and grandchildren 30 to 60 years down the line. This is very difficult. It needs to be done.